Don Huben, I'm the director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, which together with the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability is putting on today's panel discussion on Dark Money. How many of you, were any of you at the screening last night of Dark Money? Terrific, yeah, good. If you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it. It's a terrific documentary film. And we have with us the filmmaker, the director and producer, Kimberly Reed. And I will let our moderator, Michael Neblo, from the Department of Political Science and the leader of IDEA, great acronym, the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, introduce the other two speakers at today's event.
Well, thanks, Don, and thank you all for coming today. I'm going to give a slightly longer introduction to Kimberly Reed, our distinguished guest for this series of events the last couple days. She is a documentary filmmaker and producer whose works Prodigal Sons and Dark Money have garnered critical and popular acclaim. We're honored to have her with us today to talk about dark money and the role of money in politics more generally. Also, to my right, I am delighted to introduce Emma Saunders-Hastings, our newest colleague in the Political Science Department. Emma did her PhD at Harvard University and most recently comes to us from a prestigious postdoc at the University of Chicago. She's an expert on democratic theory with a special emphasis on large-scale philanthropy and the role that it plays in society and democratic processes. Finally, I'm very pleased to introduce Sean Trende, a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science. Before joining our program, Sean practiced law for several years and eventually emerged as a leading political journalist. Sean is currently a senior electional analyst for Real Clear Politics and has appeared in a wide variety of media regarding politics and elections in particular. So thanks all three of you for joining us today. I'm very grateful. Here's how we'll proceed. I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to make a few very informal opening remarks about their thoughts about money in politics and Anonymity, Dark Money, the documentary, and then I will ask a few questions to kind of get the discussion rolling, and then I'll open it up to audience questions. So I hope all of you will have things that you want to ask of our panelists. So I'm very excited to get started. Kim, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, just a minute or two, just.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have.
No. So, you know, when I heard about the decision that came down from the U.S. Supreme Court in 2010 called Citizens United, I was really intrigued. I'm usually very skeptical of slippery slope arguments, but I think like a lot of people, it seemed to me that doing what Citizens United did, which is to allow unlimited money in politics, to be spent in politics, was not a good idea. It seemed like there was enough money already. However, at the same time, as a documentary filmmaker, I was also intrigued with some of the counter-arguments that you heard right away, which almost all of which go back to the First Amendment and freedom of speech. And as a filmmaker, that's my stock and trade. I mean, it's all about that. So I didn't quite know what to do with that topic, with that issue, until a couple of years later, when my home state of Montana decided to basically push back against Citizens United. It had a case that was going to the U.S. Supreme Court, and as a filmmaker, I realized I could tell this story. I could wrap it around these real human beings talking about real issues, and not just have this abstract discussion about money in politics, which gets pretty abstract and pretty, frankly, boring kind of quickly. So to tell that story with these real people was where I launched into it. And I would just say that I mean, I certainly developed some opinions about money in politics, and I can share those with you later. But entering into the film with all of these questions about how what the role of money in politics is and how that bumps up against free speech constraints was a really interesting debate for me to follow, and that's what I did. And maybe we can throw one last thing out there. It became really interesting for me because the whole question about Citizens United actually goes back to a documentary film. There was an organization called Citizens United, and they made a film. It was about an hour and a half long. It was called Hillary the Movie, and the whole question in Citizens United was whether this thing that they created should be considered a political speech or whether it's just a documentary, and that where you draw the lines between those two is a very, very interesting question for me as well.
Great, thank you so much, Adam.
Sure. Well, so for those of you who weren't there last night especially, it's a wonderful movie, I recommend it, but it raised questions in sort of three domains of democratic theory and political science for me. So the first is, what is the relationship between dark money and campaign outcomes, right? Who wins in an electoral campaign? Does this make a difference? The second was, what's the relationship between dark money and influence over legislators once they're elected, right? A lot of people that would be referred to buying politicians, right? The implication they're in the pocket of these interests, they might be coordinating when. And then thirdly, what's the relationship between dark money and public trust in democratic institutions? This came up a lot as well. And I think for all of those questions, it's partly an empirical matter, what are the relationships here, but partly you want to have a normative picture in mind of what the right distribution of political influence or the right state of public trust in democracy would look like in order to evaluate whether or not something's a problem. And something that struck me in the film, you referred a few times in your remarks yesterday to Montana being a microcosm for what was going on in the rest of the country, but what really struck me in some ways was how distinctive Montana seemed to be in its answers to those questions. There was a suggestion that because of its history, because of this legacy of corporate exploitation, they were to some degree inoculated against this, or at least there was more skepticism than you would see in other states, that the effect of dark money on public trust was more immediately registered there than it might have been elsewhere, which I found a really interesting strand in the movie. Just a couple of other questions I had maybe for the discussion. One is, whatever picture you have in mind of the right distribution of democratic influence, what factors matter morally as disruptions of that? So, number one, does it matter if the money's coming from corporations versus individuals? Oftentimes in the movie, people express particular suspicion of corporate money. But of course, the majority of independent expenditures post-Citizens United come from individuals rather than corporate donors. Is that any better democratically? And then secondly, this is maybe just something as a Canadian that I picked up on, but people repeatedly express worries that it could be foreign money that's influencing elections. And on what assumptions does that matter more, right? Stevens, in his dissent in Citizens United, explicitly raised this possibility, and was in the New York Times this morning praising a past Kavanaugh ruling where he ruled that Canadians can't make photocopies in support of political candidates. But if we don't think that money has a corrupting influence, the claim of the Supreme Court has been that it doesn't, that unequal influence isn't the same as corruption and therefore it doesn't rise to the bar of something we can regulate, then why would foreign money be any worse, given that that influence is still mediated by voters, ultimately, at least at the campaign stage? I guess the last question that I came away with, the movie sort of ends on this note, that the problem is the FEC is broken, that we're not enforcing campaign finance laws, and the implication seems to be that either better enforcement or better regulation, a stronger FEC could save us. And I wonder whether that's right. I guess I'm a little bit skeptical about the ability of any regulatory system to eliminate the problem that there's super rich people who have preferences about public outcomes and want to use their money to bring those about. And so is there a risk that whatever regulation you have, there's going to be some space that money goes? I study philanthropy, and so I think inside politics, there's a huge concern around this. I'd be interested to hear your views on how much the solution can be regulatory versus political. That is, if we're worried about dark money on the right, is the answer really that we need to create countervailing power on the other side rather than trust to better referees to solve the problem?
Thank you all for having me here. And I was just struck thinking how lucky you are to be from Montana, which is arguably the most beautiful state in the Union. If you've ever had the opportunity to drive across it, or if you haven't, you should take advantage of it at some point. It's also an interesting state politically because you do get this history of, it's diverse. You have ranching interests in the west and east and mining interests in the west. It's a state that leans red, but you have two counties, Silver Bow and the one next to it that I'm blanking on, that have a Democratic voting pattern stretching back into the 1920s precisely because of the fights over Anaconda and other mining interests in the west. What I would say up front, I think it's interesting, I want to kind of just give some big picture things. It's interesting that there is a convergence on the right of these debates and the left of these debates about a couple things. The first is that the Supreme Court has drawn a distinction between contributions and expenditures. You can regulate contributions to candidates, but expenditures on a candidate's behalf, you can't. And I think the right and the left on this debate would both agree that that distinction breaks down very, very quickly. Now, what you do about that, whether you say you should be able to regulate expenditures or you shouldn't be able to regulate contributions, is a very sharp point of divergence. And I don't take it upon myself to believe I'm going to convince anyone in this room in an hour of my view on this, and vice versa. I do throw out there, though, that there is broad agreement that that distinction is extremely problematic. The other thing, and there's less unifying force on this, but broadly speaking, there's a sense that disclosure is, in the absence of being able to work out this contribution expenditure thing, disclosure is one of the solutions to the problem. There's some people who will take a hardcore, no, you can't even mandate disclosure stance, but generally speaking, the conservative response to the campaign finance issue has been show sunlight on it, do what Virginia has done, where candidates have been taken down in primaries because of the money that they have taken in. Harry McAuliffe in 2009 was an example of this. It gets a little hairy when you get to disclosures of corporations, but there is some broad agreement there. The final thing, and I will just throw this out to you as where I think the debate about corporate personhood and the First Amendment rights of corporations becomes problematic, is this. When we have these discussions in public, it tends to revolve around entities that many people on the left and a lot of people on the right will think of as the bad guys. Americans for Prosperity, the mining companies, the environmental polluters and so forth. But a lot of different groups are corporations. The NAACP was founded in 1909 in New York, and 2 years later filed its articles of incorporation with New York State. If you're going to take a hard stance that corporations should not have any First Amendment rights, then in the 1950s, when the state of Alabama was trying to get the donation list for the NAACP so they could dox the donors, expose them effectively, and shut it down, if corporations have no First Amendment rights, then that wasn't problematic. Now, there's a whole lot of gray in between Citizens United and corporations have no rights. I'm just saying that extreme pushes you in some really uncomfortable territory, and we should probably look for a more nuanced position somewhere in the middle. There are those positions, like only for-profit corporations should lose rights. That's a little more defensible, I think, than the hardcore no corporate rights. But anyway, that I think sets a stage for hopefully a lively discussion.
Great, thank you all three of you for setting that up. Sean, you saying that there is agreement on the right and the left around anonymity throws me a bit of a curveball, because my first question is going to start with a comment and move into a question. One of the most interesting things from my perspective about the movie is that it zeroes in on the role of anonymity and not just money as speech by itself. And it poses the question, what does it mean to say that money equals speech if there's no identifiable speaker, right? And so, as you know, even on the right, there are some people that agree that the sunshine approach is the best way to handle this. But I think that there is a certain amount of disagreement on that. And as I was thinking about it, it occurred to me that the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers were published under pseudonyms. And it might not be too much to say that such an approach to pamphleting was routine, perhaps even the norm during the 18th century. Along those lines, it does not seem crazy to me that arguments should stand on their own, rather than relying either positively or negatively on ethos. That is to say, why is it worrying that why is worrying about anonymity not a version of a weak appeal to authority or a kind of anti-authority, right? So there's appeals to authority, which are, unless there's expertise, widely thought to be fallacious appeals. And similarly, there's kind of anti-appeals to authority, that you're damned by the nature of the speaker rather than the content of the argument. And I guess, again, I would say, except under unusual circumstances, it seems to me that you could make a case that's a fallacious approach. And so I just want to talk, throw out and problematize the notion that anonymity is necessarily a bad thing, and perhaps might even keep us focused on the content of the argument rather than who's making the argument. Thoughts?
So there is a caveat that I threw out there on the disclosure thing, which is I think where the conservatives come down on the sunshine issue is all the donations to the candidate get disclosed. Where it becomes more problematic is where you have a corporation that donates to a candidate, and you want to then extract the donors to the corporation. And if there's corporations giving to the corporations, then kind of follow the chain back. That's where I think you get some dissension, and I think you also start to run into some bad history, because we do have a history of governments trying to use this to shut down speech that today we would think of as good. On the appeal to authority, I'm actually a little less persuaded by that, because I think there's a fine line between an ad hominem attack and pointing out bias, or a that it's not a statement against interest, it's a statement that furthers your own particular interest, that can alter a way someone would be processing information. So, pointing out that the Koch brothers are taking a position on something that just happens to, mean that they have to pay $1 billion less in taxes, I think is fair game. I don't think it's the death blow that some make it out to be, because there is some ad hom wrapped up in there, but pointing out bias, I mean, it's admissible in court. I think it's fair.
So I think I agree that it's not anonymity itself that's the problem. What I worry about is the added incentive anonymity gives to the creator. And so, like I said, independent expenditures explode after Citizens United, but it's mostly from individuals who had the right to make these since probably in the 70s, right? So why do we see this huge increase in individual donations for independent expenditures after Citizens United? Well, I mean, still an empirical question, but I think largely because now you have super PACs that you can get some distance from and don't need to put your name on an issue ad or something the way you once might have. And so it's more the factors of it that I'm interested in. And I guess the other thing I would say is, although I don't think anonymity is per se a problem, that doesn't mean that I think there is a right to anonymous speech. And so would we be violating any rights by limiting anonymity? I don't think so.
Yeah, I would agree with that, this right to anonymity is a counter argument I hear coming from the far right, that having to declare who you are is somehow some sort of compelled speech, which I think is an interesting constitutional debate that we can probably unwind for the rest of the hour about the extent to which there is something called compelled speech. But the issue that I keep coming back to, which I feel like I was pretty in touch with following this story for 6 years in this microcosm, which does have some unique characteristics, is that voters just can't make the decisions that they need to make as voters. They can't be informed members of the citizenry if there is that anonymous speech. And it's something that they just really demand to know. And I think that, as both of you point out, that because one of the things about Montana is that it is exceptionally beautiful, and I say that as somebody who grew up there, we're quite proud of it. But I think that also makes people really sensitive to scars in the landscape that are oftentimes created when people treat that with carelessness, and it does make you really skeptical, and it does make you pay attention in a way that maybe people in other states won't. And the lesson that has a lot of Montanans have gathered, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm speaking unanimously, but there's 75-80% of like poll after poll kind of falls in the same zone, that when that speech is anonymous, the long-term effect of that is this carelessness. And when you combine that with the profit motive that comes from for-profit corporations that are making money off of this, that at the end of the day, that anonymity is a very damaging thing. So yes, those long-term effects at the end of the day, I think are kind of force me to take our whole conversation and put it in the real world of political discourse, which is a pretty messy, ugly place. And even though we could probably take the premise of your question and have two anonymous speakers, on either side of the room, and listen to the purity of that debate, and who was speaking wouldn't matter. But when you inject profit motive, when you inject the fact that when there is profit motive and there is political power to be manipulated, that money is naturally going to gravitate towards that political discussion and try to control it, I think that's a completely different environment for that debate to take place in.
Okay, great. I'm going to riff off of that and tie it back to something that Emma mentioned in her opening remarks, which is a normative framework for the distribution of influence. And the thing that occurred to me about that is how that is to be given operational traction. It seems to me that that's a very tricky problem, in that if the idea is that we have unequal megaphones, I'm sorry, I'm not doing a very good job of this. So I want to draw a distinction between distribution of influence in principle and in fact. And if we had and how we would operationalize or get traction on what influence in fact looks like. Because it seems to me that merely having a larger megaphone, just so long as the other side has access to the marketplace of ideas, so to speak, that it's a very tricky thing to say that people are being falsely persuaded by the extra money that's pouring in from one side versus the other. Now, if it's a complete rout such that the imbalance is massive, then it seems to me that there's a prima facie reason to believe that there's a skew here, or that there's a large-scale effect on the outcomes. But ultimately, voters have recourse to policies that they don't like. Again, I mean, for whatever it's worth, I'm sort of playing the devil's advocate here. But I want to think through this fairly, and it occurs to me that it's open to people saying that ultimately citizens have recourse to punish policymakers who don't implement the policies that they like, and that merely presuming that a heavy burden falls on someone who wants to say we should directly regulate political speech in order to get a different set of outcomes. So I guess I'll start with Emma here, but the other two panelists should feel free to weigh in, is how we would know what it means to say an equal distribution of influence.
Right. I mean, so the first thing I'll point out about your devil's advocate remarks is I don't think they give a basis for limiting foreign contributions either, right? If the argument is let the argument stand and then voters have recourse for themselves to decide what policies they want or don't want, well then I'm not sure why I, as a Canadian or Russian or whatever else, can't also make independent expenditure maybe I put it too narrowly in saying we need a conception of the appropriate distribution of influence, because not every conception of democracy turns on that precisely. Something that people in the film last night appealed to a lot was this concept of a citizen legislator. There seemed to be a democratic ideal of a citizen legislator. So then what you need to answer is, well, what is it to be a citizen legislator? In what way does the influence of money undermine that ideal? Is it about who you're responsive to? Is it about sort of your own interests in seeking election? You could think of different answers to the question, but it wouldn't necessarily turn on a specific distribution of influence that we want, so much as a conception of how representation is supposed to work.
Yeah, and it's, I would also just point out that, that citizen legislature, this kind of ideal that is portrayed in the film that people really, I think, identify with and feel pretty proud of the fact that in Montana the legislature only meets every other year, and they do it for 90 days. And there are, you know, there are positives to that. Then I feel like it brings in a lot of people who just are not professional politicians. You know, they have lives outside of their legislating that are bigger and generate income, and that probably account for the influence they have in the world more than the political position that they hold. The flip side of that too is that I think it makes legislators more vulnerable to precisely things like this dark money spending, like these kind of larger, more organized forces who are coming in to try to message policy in a way that makes folks who only think about this every other year for 90 days much more vulnerable to arguments that are kind of being packaged the rest of the year, the rest of the 2 years.
There's a famous political scientist named E. Schneider, and I'm generally speaking not a fan of him, but he has two quotes that kind of resonate, and they're actually kind of both relevant to this debate. The first is, there was debate in political science early on where people kind of made this exact argument, pluralistic argument of interest groups, that these things are just representing voters, and you have these two different sides and they'll fight each other out and the voters can make up their minds. But Schneider's response was that the problem with pluralistic heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with an upper class accent. And I do think that is relevant here, that there isn't as much money that flows into some of the consumer advocacy groups as there is into business interest groups. The second one is that the people are sovereign, but they only speak when spoken to, and their vocabulary is limited to yes or no. And so while people might not like a vote that's cast on a mining interest bill, they might be persuaded. They can only say yes or no. So if that same legislator also takes a host of stances on other issues the person cares about, gun control, abortion, you can list them. They have to make the choice. Like, they either have to sacrifice the mining interest or the social issue interest thing. And a lot of times they're going to vote for the more high-profile issue. So I think that conception is a little problematic. I will throw out, and I'm not sure I agree with this, but one possible response to this problem of these are more low-profile races. People don't know much about them. They're not professional legislators, so they're not on television every day. One possible issue is that perhaps we need more money in these state politics, and more money, that we do need to more level the playing field, not by bringing the level of spending on one side down, but by bringing the spending on the other side up, that you all should get involved. One of the responses for you all to get involved, to donate to good government groups that can get a message out that fights the special, because those groups exist. And maybe we need a better informed electorate as a response.
Would you extend that to public financing of elections?
Personally, I think we know that candidate spending, you get diminishing returns at a certain point, usually around $500,000. The relationship between candidate spending and their results levels out. I would be perfectly happy giving seed money to candidates that emerge from politics, so that every candidate has a certain amount of money to get out their issues. I would not want to pair that, as most people do, with a limit on the amount you can spend, because I think spending and speech are good things. But just being able to make sure that both sides can get out their money, or can get out their message in campaigns, I'm fine with that.
I think that Michael Malbin at the Campaign Finance Institute has research really, from what I've seen, really bears that out.
Great. I'm going to turn to audience questions after one more thing that I'm going to toss out here, and I think it's sort of an emergent question. So I'm very struck so far by the panel on how much everything is hinging on empirical conditions on the ground. The arguments, if we stay at the level of principle, which courts often are stuck doing, if we stay at the level of principle, it doesn't seem to be, it's a more complicated or more balanced sort of question. And a lot of the responses seem to really hinge on consequences and empirical details on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. For whatever it's worth, I agree with that. But I'll, again, and this is the last time I'll play the devil's advocate, the worrisome thing about that is empirics are really tricky, especially in these open system environments. We can't run randomized controlled trials on campaign finance. So really working out the causal pathways that are involved here is a very tricky business, and then mapping the normative desiderata from a democratic theory point of view onto the trade-offs associated with that in the empirical world seems like a very fraught process. And I could see courts taking kind of a small c, I don't mean movement conservative, I just mean saying, this is a very detailed set of arguments with a lot of uncertainty around it. We're going to stay at the level of principle because the empirics are highly indeterminate, and the relationship in terms of the value trade-offs in the normative democratic principles are a really tricky business. So that's my last question, and I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Thoughts?
Can I just toss in there that the last U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice or Chief Justice that was on the court who had been an elected official was Sandra Day O'Connor. So that experience holding elected office is something that is no longer represented.
I think, the court says that there is compelling governmental interest in fighting corruption in the appearance of corruption. And then the question is, okay, well, how do you prove how much corruption there is, if any, from spending? And the answer is kind of, the data is garbage, to be blunt. Sheila Krumholtz, I know Sheila Krumholtz, maybe we can work on her to get the open secrets data in order. But you can't just download a data set of campaign contributions from 1974 to the present. As far as I know, it doesn't exist online, which makes what we try to do really tough. And then you have the problem that I think a lot of social scientists overlook, which is that the people on the Supreme Court are not social scientists. I think if you try to give any of them, I would bet a large amount of money that none of them could give a ballpark definition of what a p-value is. And so, and you saw that in the oral argument over in the Wisconsin case. Both the Chief Justice saying that what the plaintiffs were arguing for was sociological gobbledygook, which is a direct quote, but also from Justice Kagan, who was like, I think you all have it down to an art, which is also not true. Instead, what you find is that the justices kind of gravitate to the social science that happens to support their viewpoint because they don't understand the social science. So even if we could do it well, it's really tough to get these 9 elderly attorneys to be able to evaluate it properly. And I can't use the elderly attorneys line that much longer because I'm only 5 years younger than the youngest justice now, which is
I guess what I would the reason the difficult empirical questions matter so much is because of the Supreme Court's decisions, we have to speak in the language of corruption and trying to show evidence of corruption if we want to make the case for regulation. That requires showing that it prevents some pathway of influence that's improper. I would be happier to say political equality is a compelling government interest for regulating speech. And I would be happier with the Supreme Court that would say that. Marshall came close to saying that in the Austin case, which was overturned with Citizens United. I think the possibility of that happening receded for a long time after O'Connor retired, but as late as 2003, the court was affirming that decision in the O'Connor case. And so it's not a fantasy that you could have some kind of conception of political equality treated as a rationale for regulating speech. I'll disagree with Sean and say that I would be happy to level down as well as level up in spending, at least at some level. I think above a certain threshold doesn't raise the same kind of concerns about free speech. But I guess if you're happy you're not getting into the empirics, then just say political equality is a good reason to limit speech and think through the consequences of that and figure out how to get a court that will say that too.
I don't have as much, I think an anecdote might be more interesting. I apologize for those of you who were here at the film last night, but there was a political scientist who was trying to do some research to get that hardcore empirical data, and they did so by studying the effects of information, as you're talking about, the extent to which that actually increased voter turnout. So these researchers at Stanford took it upon themselves to create these postcards that look a lot like political flyers. They marketed it as a voting guide. They put the great seal of the state of Montana on that postcard, and they sent it out to controlled, to have about 5-6 counties, and they did it in 2 states, in Montana and in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, they didn't hear a peep from people. They got some data that they couldn't really draw conclusions from. But in Montana, where people had been paying attention to these postcards and asking where the money was coming from and what is the influence, and just having a small number of people flooded with a lot of money that was pushing all of these postcards, election cycle after election cycle, there was a huge amount of skepticism, and people automatically assumed that this data, that this political science study was some dark money group that was coming into a state that was trying to control the political debate again. And there was such an outcry against this manipulation and trying to get some people in some county to turn out at the expense of other people in other counties to not turn out, that it kind of threw a wrench in the whole works of that study. But I think it just goes to show how difficult it is to gather those empirics, because it's how do you find the control of those things?
Well, you can, but it's doing it ethically. That is a notorious case in political science. So much so, in my own presentations, I do field research. I have a whole slide on why we're not like the Montanans.
Oh, you use that?
I do, because that's the first question I get if I go to the end. Because that would be problematic. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience. Yeah, we'll start here.
When the Chamber of Commerce first made the pitch that they had a right to spend unlimited amount of money, corporate money, anonymously, they did so through a group called Citizens for a Strong Ohio. When it was ultimately disclosed who these citizens were, 99% were corporations, for-profit, massive corporations. They spent $4 million in a vicious, defamatory attack against the sitting Ohio Supreme Court Justice. When President Obama proposed that he was considering issuing an executive order requiring that federal contractors disclose their political expenditures, the Chamber of Commerce came out with a statement, a press release, saying if he does that, all options will be on the table. Well, my question to the panel is, what do you think of the merit of President Obama's proposal that federal contractors should disclose their political expenditures?
I mean, it just so happens that the only governor in the U.S. to do that at the state level is Governor Steve Bullock from Montana. Issued that proclamation recently to have that enacted at the state level. I don't have the numbers, contributions right at the tip of my tongue. But I think there's a lot of ways to shine sunlight, and that's one of them. I don't personally see any problems with the fact that if a corporation is going to be doing business with, in this example, the state of Montana, that we should know where they are spending their political contributions, their independent expenditures, as somebody who's paying taxes in Montana. The argument goes that we need to know who's trying to influence that policy. So it makes sense to me. I don't see problems at all.
This is where I said, like, you start to get some broad agreement on the right and the left. Disclosure isn't something that I have a huge problem with. I think we have to be mindful of some of the times that it's been used in improper fashions, and those really do exist. But at the end of the day, I see a couple students from my class here, so this stuff really does have relevance to the real world. It's spending with strings attached. Like it's the government, it's the president saying, if you want to do business with the government, this is what you have to do in exchange, and we have a lengthy history of that happening in the country. That wouldn't keep me awake at night.
Yeah, I agree with that. That if you don't know, and I don't think you were suggesting that would be sufficient to eliminate the kinds of problems that
Yeah, the problem is, it's not anonymous speech, it's misrepresentation of who the speaker is. Citizens for Strong Ohio, or whatever group they call it. It's a lie. They're concealing their interests, because it's all for-profit corporations. The guy running the Chamber of Commerce Institute for Legal Reform at the time, in 2005 through 2010, Citizens United, was James Comey, Senior Vice President General Counsel of Lockheed Martin, and Chairman of the Board of the Chambers Institute. That's their interest. And to present that and to use these phony names, it's a fraud. So when the NAACP speaks as a corporation, everybody knows who they are. They know their integrity, their credibility, their history of fine work. When citizens or whatever they call themselves, it's a lie, it's a fraud, and there ought to be legal regulation to protect the public against that fraud.
So I guess the way of putting the question is the concern limited to the fraud, though? Suppose there was full disclosure and you still saw the same scale of independent spending. Would there be any remaining worry? I tend to think there would be. In post-2012, the Koch brothers have actually gotten more and more open about signing their name to what they do. They encourage the participants in the Koch seminars to write op-eds saying, I'm a proud member of the Koch seminars and here's why. And given that some people seem happy to give in these sort of massive scales, even without anonymity, I would still wonder what the effects of that would be. But nothing in that speaks against it.
But as far as the ethics of this, importantly, Justice Kennedy, the deciding vote in Citizens United, the whole ethical basis of his position was that there would be full and immediate disclosure through the internet of contributions.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Yeah, over here.
So, do any of you see a future where Citizens United, either by the actions of the Supreme Court or Congress, would ever be overturned?
No.
Ever?
I mean, you can never say never, but not, I mean, the constitutional amendment process is getting 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the states to sign on. We've done it 27 times in our history, and one of those amendments took 207 years to ratify, so I'm skeptical. As far as the makeup of the court, I mean, certainly with you know, Justice Kennedy, I think almost certainly being replaced by a conservative justice. The oldest justice now is going to be 70, or the oldest conservative justice is going to be 70. It's at least a decade till he's replaced, so I'm skeptical.
I think you would probably need to pack the part, but if you did that, then it would be overturned. I mean, the things that Citizens United makes illegal were affirmed as legal as recently as 2003. It's not that there's judges that don't have there's a case for this. So the current judges don't. There's no chance that the current court would vote to overturn it, but
I'm afraid I agree with them, but I also usually, when I'm asked about this, try to turn things back to disclosure and how it's important to remember that even under Citizens United, disclosure was mandated. Essentially, the whole Citizens United decision was like built on the presumption that there would be disclosure, which we clearly don't have. And that focusing on that and turning the tide of that is going to be the most effective thing. So I don't want you to like lose hope and despair that there's even though you don't have a repeal of Citizens United on the horizon, there's still plenty of things you can do in the short term.
I mean, I guess the other thing to say in terms of shorter term actions is that given that there is almost a hydraulics problem in campaign finance, right? Money's going to flow around obstacles, it wants to go somewhere. Are there better places we can try to send it? Campaign fund goal is about making soft money contributions to parties illegal, but if you're worried about dark money and the influence of independent expenditures, maybe that's better, right? Maybe you want to redirect more of the money to political parties, or at least seems like a conceivable option on the table. And so I think it's also about thinking creatively about not trying to labor into the illusion that you can stop rich people from wanting to influence public outcomes, but there are better ways to try to incentivize them to do it in different ways.
And the other, I think, key incentive to kind of wrap our arms around that problem is what sort of incentives do people running for office have? And as a candidate, if my incentive is to only appeal to millionaires and billionaires at cocktail parties, which is typically how a fundraising, campaign goes, there are a lot of things, and it seems like we have some agreement up here, and there's oftentimes a lot of agreement, and we've seen it work in the past, that public financing for campaigns tends to incentivize, especially if you have matching funds, where small donations are matched by a pool of public financing. That really incentivizes candidates for office to talk to people who aren't just a bunch of rich people at cocktail parties. And I think that holds a lot of promise.
Yeah, on the candidate incentive end, I guess the other thing I would throw in is here, I really do think it is political rather than regulatory. Right? Like, you can affect some of this with things like public financing. You can also affect it by knowing that you'll be primaried by someone with small donors if you take too much money from large anonymous groups. And you've seen some of this in the Democratic primaries this year. And so I think within a regulatory structure, there's a political question about what kinds of actions and rhetoric be used to incentivize one or another structure of contributions that can be thrown on.
One other thing I'll throw out just to think about is that, to kind of come back to where I was at the beginning, if Citizens United is overruled, it very much matters how it's overruled. And I would encourage people in this room who are advocating for the overruling of Citizens United to give some thought to exactly how you want to do it. If it's the what you tend to hear the most in kind of lay conversations around Citizens United, we want to do away with corporate free speech rights. I mean, that has some very strong consequences because there are a lot of corporations that make speeches that, regardless of which side of the divide you're on, you like and you want them to be able to make. The other thing is to think back. The facts of Citizens United get lost in a lot of the debate about the holding of Citizens United. The facts of Citizens United is that not massive company wanted to put out a movie that was critical, put it on pay-per-view that was critical of Hillary Clinton. Extremely critical of her. You should have some, if you're a political small L liberal, you should have some discomfort with the idea that the government could say you can't put out this movie during a certain time period before an election, because you're accompanied, because almost all, not all, but almost all movies that we see are put out by corporations of some sort, even if they're small corporations. So again, how we do it matters. The facts of Citizens United, I think, are something you should be uncomfortable with, even if you want the ruling reversed.
That's kind of where I started,
Yeah.
this whole project and those questions.
So I want to talk about I think the political equality question is worth expanding on. I'm thinking of Foster Friess. He's this kind of obscure billionaire in Wyoming, and he recently ran for some statewide office in Wyoming. He didn't do very well personally, and like he's not a particularly pleasant guy. He's kind of weird. But in 2012, like Rick Santorum was his guy, and he funded a super PAC and kept Rick Santorum in that race for much longer than Rick Santorum had a right to be in that race politically. So I'm thinking of the sort of money of speech versus the political equality conceptions of what we want our campaign finance system to look like, and how you guys feel about that case of a guy with no real political constituency being able to get his views out there and really crowd out like other voices in the race that might have had broader constituencies, as a way to expand on that.
And that was in a race where each candidate sort of had their guy who was bankrolling them, and led to a really interesting. There were a lot of people who had much more wind in their sails in that big public debate than they would have had otherwise.
So sometimes referred to as the money primary, getting their backer in place. Yeah, I mean, I think that example puts it well, because it's not quite the case that money buys you an election. It doesn't always, right? Plenty of people with rich backers lose, but it buys you a second and a third and a fourth look from voters that you don't otherwise get. I think an appropriate compromise in that kind of situation could be setting a cap for contributions. So pick an arbitrary number. Sean says that the effects level off at 500,000, so set it there, right? That's still a huge amount of money, vastly more than most other people, but it seems to me to strike an appropriate balance. Now, what the actual number is, I don't know, but public financing combined with some kind of cap like that seems to me an appropriate way of addressing what I think is a compelling government interest of political equality in ways that don't meaningfully violate free speech.
I mean, I think Foster Friess is kind of a counter-argument as well as an argument. As you know, like, he bombed in the Wyoming gubernatorial primary, which is a trick in Wyoming. It's a small state. Like, it doesn't take a lot of money to get your message out. I do kind of take some issue, though, about the idea that Rick Santorum stayed in that race too long, or longer than he had any business staying in. I don't like Rick Santorum. He's kind of in many ways the opposite of my politics. But I remember from 2000 where George W. Bush's game against John McCain in the Republican primary was just to wait him out, because he knew McCain was going to run out of money sooner or later, because we didn't really have internet spending where you guys could get together and all contribute $5 or $10 on the internet and it would add up. You had to actually do the transaction cost of writing the check, putting the stamp on it, going to the mailbox. Like, it's just much more easier for people to contribute to their candidates now. And so what we're seeing is that, you know, these candidates that do appeal to factions within the Republican Party or the Democratic Party are staying in longer and longer because money isn't an issue for them. They're able to keep their issues out there, not have bad second-order effects in 2016, and that the Republican Party remained fractured and Donald Trump kind of snuck up the middle. But you know, I think it's kind of good that Rick Santorum was representing the social conservative, the really social conservative wing of the Republican Party well into the primary. The other thing, and this is where the causal arrow gets really difficult to tease out. Like, not only do we not have good data to allow us to find the correlations, but the causation gets tricky. Like, did, you know, Foster Friess change any of Rick Santorum's viewpoints? No, I don't think so. Like, he was always kind of a nut. But like, the reason that Rick Santorum had Foster Friess behind him, and not Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers or any of these other groups, is because Foster Friess is kind of a nut. So, you know, it's not like anything was bought for Santorum, it just was a faction of the Republican Party that wanted to get its message out there for the Republican Party throughout the Republican primary campaign in a way that's a good thing.
I guess to the extent that capping speech is the word, there's another good option, which is just tax all this money, right? That you're just taking away fungible money, not yet speech money. There's no objection to that, unless you think that the speech objection applies to taxation.
Huh?
Well,
I mean, if the idea is that if we tax the rich till there aren't rich anymore, there won't be rich influence in politics, that's true, but I wouldn't sign up for that for other reasons.
yeah, I mean, I think that's the other option, that if you believe that taxing specifically political speech raises.
Oh, so you would,
limiting.
so you would say you would have like a marginal tax rate on your contributions to candidates, and if you give more than $500,000, those dollars are subject to like an 80% tax rate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would work.
So, just at the base of American democracy and politics is the belief of equality of opportunity and not equality of outcome. While I morally do not agree with the fact that the rich can influence an election for that, if they're within their legal rights and are not obscuring any legalities, shouldn't the corporations fundamentally and constitutionally be allowed to contribute to something they believe in as they spend their time building up the company, and if the head of that company has the same political ideologies as a candidate, shouldn't they be able to support them freely?
Yeah, I think then everything depends on what your underlying account of what their legal rights should be. Because do they have a legal right to all of the pre-taxing money that they get from their corporate activities? They do, but should they, right? And so I think sort of the account of property rights is what matters there. I agree that it's legal, and so the question is what the laws should be, not are people morally wrong for doing things that they're legally permitted to do.
I think we have time for one more question, John.
Okay, Mike talked a lot about empirics, and this is not my field, correct me if I'm wrong. As far as I can tell, most of the political science literature suggests elections don't make that much difference, campaigns don't make that much difference. Diana Mutz did an article in Neblo a few years ago saying that the only reason people spend money on it is they're being snookered by campaign advisors. And most campaigns seem to be basically what we call fake news. As everybody knows, as Procter & Gamble never tells you how to get somebody else's toothpaste or you don't want to get out there. There's candidates are always a certain amount of record or also the opposition is. So if you have simply tons more money, then it won't probably make much difference to the outcome. We have Donald Trump as president, who's been vastly less Hillary Clinton, for example. It won't make much difference that just that this material that people are inundated with would be piled higher and deeper without any real consequence. So she's got to be taken into consideration. Of course, vast majority of people don't vote at all. Anyway, with eligible voters. They decide to use their democratic freedoms to do other things, like pay attention to politics and policy.
I mean, I think that's where you run into the data just isn't very good. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of work that's been done suggesting that I saw the guy with the chalkboard showing the causal chain, and the chain between, you know, they put out the postcards and it affects how people vote. It is tough to prove, but a lot of the work that's been done on that just has been done with less than ideal data. We have some experiments, which the problem with experiments is that they're always hard to generalize because people tend to know they're an experiment. Yeah, so
hundreds of studies that have shown that.
yeah, but it's just they tend to be problematic. I mean, I don't think we have our minds really around what this relationship is, if there is one. But I'm also a little skeptical just on a non-empirical basis for the reason you said. I mean, I get a ton of mailers, and they just go immediately in the trash. And I'm politically active, so.
I mean, I think it's important that campaigns aren't necessarily the only thing you'd be interested in, right? influence the outcomes of campaigns. You might worry about how contributions like that influence legislative changes once they're in place, and that's something that the film also touches on a lot, like a feeling of indebtedness that legislators might have, rightly or wrongly, to people who contribute toward their campaigns. So that could be another rationale for regulating, as could public trust, right? I mean, if it's dramatically eroding faith in the democracy, as it seemed to have been in Montana, then you might think, right or wrong, it should be limited. But I guess I do agree that if you're going to have rich people pouring millions and billions of dollars into an election, it would be better that they do it in effective ways, just like a sort of elite form of gambling. And so that could be another case where the hydraulic point comes in. We should direct it to flashy, but ultimately inefficacious spending.
Yeah, and I would just kind of underline kind of where you started with what you were saying, is that I think some of the biggest gainers in the post-Citizens United world are political consultants. And they're the ones who are really breaking it in. There's a lot of examples, election cycle after election cycle, of talk about hydraulics. That's where much of the money is being steered in these unlimited expenditures.
I hope you'll all join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all.